The Valkyrie warship hung in the darkness of space like a metal mountain. Its hull covered in the scars of 100 conquered worlds, and inside its command bridge, High Commander Thaxfer stood with his arms crossed behind his back as he watched the tiny human shuttle approach. He was tall, even by Valkyrie standards, standing at nearly 9 feet with scales the color of dried blood and eyes that glowed like dying embers. And he had personally overseen the subjugation of 37 species during his long career, each one falling to their knees before the might of the Dominion. They send only one small vessel. His second officer clicked in amusement, the sound of Valkyrie laughter filling the bridge as the other warriors joined in. Thaxfor allowed himself a thin smile as he studied the approaching craft, noting its primitive construction and laughable armor plating. And he wondered why the Galactic Council had warned him about these creatures called humans. For months, rumors had spread through conquered space about a new species on the edge of the galaxy, a species that other races spoke of in hushed and fearful tones. But looking at their technology now, Thaxfer could not understand why anyone would fear such obviously inferior beings. The shuttle docked with a soft thump that echoed through the station, and Thaxfer made his way to the greeting chamber with 20 of his finest warriors at his back, each one bred for combat and standing ready to remind these humans of their place in the universe. The doors slid open with a hiss of pressurized air, and the human delegation stepped through. Thaxfor felt his mandibles twitch in surprise and then in contempt as he studied the newcomers, seeing a group of soft-skinned creatures in formal clothing, none of them armed, none of them wearing armor, and all of them so terribly small and fragile. But it was the military escort that drew his attention and his mockery. The human soldier was old, ancient by their species' short standards, with white hair cut close to his scalp and deep lines carved into his weathered face like the cracks in dry earth. And he walked with a slight limp that spoke of old wounds that had never fully healed. He wore a simple uniform decorated with small ribbons and medals. Nothing powered, nothing threatening. And he carried no visible weapons except for a ceremonial blade at his hip that looked more decorative than dangerous. This was what the humans sent to face the Valkyrie Dominion. This tired old creature, who looked like he might collapse from the effort of walking. Thaxfer threw back his head and laughed, a deep booming sound that shook the chamber, and his warriors joined him in a chorus of clicking mockery that filled the air with their contempt. "Is this your strongest?" Thaxfer demanded when his laughter finally subsided, gesturing at the old soldier with one clawed hand while his eyes burned with amusement. "We have heard the rumors about human tenacity and human ferocity, and we expected something more impressive than this withered creature." The human diplomats shifted uncomfortably, their fear obvious in the way they avoided meeting his gaze. But the old soldier simply stood there with his hands clasped behind his back and a small smile playing at the corners of his thin lips. The smile bothered Thaxfer more than he wanted to admit. It was not the nervous smile of prey trying to hide its terror, and it was not the false bravado of a warrior facing certain defeat, but rather something else entirely. Something knowing and patient and somehow sad. "Well," Thaxfer pressed when the silence stretched too long, "do you not speak, old one, or has age stolen your voice along with your strength?" The old soldier finally moved, taking one slow step forward while his pale blue eyes met Thaxfer's burning gaze without flinching or looking away. "My name is Marcus Cole," he said in a voice that was quiet but carried clearly through the chamber. "I hold the rank of general in the United Earth Defense Forces, though I have been retired for 7 years now." "Retired?" Thaxfer repeated with another laugh. "They send us a soldier who no longer fights. What message is this supposed to send?" "An important one," General Cole replied, and that small sad smile never left his face as he spoke. "You asked if I am our strongest, and the answer is no, I am not. I am old and tired, and my bones ache when the weather changes. And there are millions of humans who could defeat me in combat without breaking a sweat." He paused and looked around the chamber at the massive Valkyrie warriors who surrounded him, each one capable of tearing him apart with their bare claws. And he showed no fear at all. "Then why are you here?" Thaxfer demanded, his amusement beginning to fade into something like irritation at this human's strange calm. "I am here because I have seen war," Cole said simply. "I was born during a conflict that killed 30 million of my people, and I was conscripted into military service at 18 years old. And I have fought in 3 major wars and 17 smaller conflicts since then." He raised one weathered hand and pulled back his sleeve to reveal a network of old scars that covered his forearm. "Like a map of violence, I have been shot 6 times, stabbed twice, and burned once badly enough to require growing new skin. And I am considered lucky among human veterans because I am still alive." Thaxver's eyes narrowed as he tried to understand what this old creature was telling him and why it mattered. "You speak of your weakness as if it was strength." The commander said slowly no. General Cole shook his head gently. "I speak of my experience. And I tell you these things so you understand what I am." He took another step forward, close enough now that Thaxver could see every line and scar on his aged face. Close enough to see the weight of memory in those pale blue eyes. "I am not your enemy, Commander Thaxver, and I am not your opponent. And I am certainly not your strongest." The smile on his face shifted into something colder and more ancient than his years. "I am the warning." The chamber fell silent as those words hung in the air. And somewhere behind Thaxver, one of his younger officers felt a chill run down his spine, even though he could not explain why the old human soldier simply stood there, with his hands clasped behind his back and that knowing look in his eyes, waiting for Thaxver to understand what he had not yet said. And in that moment, for just one brief heartbeat, the High Commander of the Valkyrie Dominion felt something he had not felt in 200 years of conquest. He felt the first cold touch of doubt. The doubt lasted only a moment before Thaxver crushed it beneath centuries of pride and conquest. And he drew himself up to his full height as he looked down at the old human soldier with renewed contempt. "A warning," he repeated slowly, letting the word drip with mockery as his warriors clicked their amusement behind him. "You stand before the Valkyrie Dominion, conquerors of 217 species, masters in 1,000 star systems. And you call yourself a warning." General Marcus Cole did not react to the laughter or the contempt, and his expression remained calm and patient, like a teacher waiting for a difficult student to finish speaking. "Do," he said simply. Thaxver felt his scales bristle with irritation at this human's refusal to show proper fear, and he stepped closer until he towered over the old soldier like a mountain of muscle and claws. "Explain yourself then, old one, and tell me what warning a dying species could possibly offer to the greatest military force this galaxy has ever known." Cole nodded slowly as if he had expected this response, and he turned to address not just Thaxver, but all the Valkyrie warriors who filled the chamber with their massive predatory forms. "You have conquered many species," he began, his voice carrying clearly despite its quiet tone. "And I imagine they all reacted in similar ways when you arrived at their worlds." He paused and looked around the room with those pale blue eyes that had seen too much. "First, there was fear. Then there was resistance. Then there was calculation as they measured their strength against yours and found themselves lacking. And finally there was surrender when they realized that fighting would only lead to their extinction." Thaxver's mandibles clicked in agreement because this was exactly how every conquest had proceeded. And it was simply the natural order of things for the weak to submit to the strong. "This is how the universe works," the commander said with a gesture of his clawed hand. "The strong rule and the weak serve, and there is no shame in accepting this truth. For them, Perhaps, Cole replied, and something shifted in his expression. Something that made him look less like a tired old man and more like something else entirely. But you need to understand that humans are not like the species you have conquered before. He reached into his uniform and several Valkyrie warriors tensed with their hands moving toward their weapons. But Cole only pulled out a small data chip that glinted in the chamber's harsh lighting. "This contains our complete military history," he said as he held up the chip. "Every war we have ever fought. Every weapon we have ever created. Every tactic we have ever used. And I offer it to you freely, because I want you to understand what you are dealing with." Thaxfer gestured for his science officer, a smaller female named Kethril, to come forward and take the chip. And she did so with obvious curiosity in her amber eyes. "Why would you give us this information?" Thaxfer asked with suspicion clouding his voice. "Is this some kind of trick?" "No trick." Cole shook his head slowly. "I give you this because I want peace, and I believe that once you understand humanity, you will want peace too." The commander made a dismissive sound in his throat as he waved for Kethril to begin analyzing the data. "You speak of peace, but you dress like a soldier, and you carry yourself like a warrior despite your age. So tell me truthfully, old human, what are you really here to do?" Cole was silent for a long moment, and when he spoke again, his voice carried the weight of decades and the echo of memories that would never fade. "I told you I was born during a war," he said. "It was called the Pacific Resource Conflict, and it lasted 11 years and killed 30 million people on both sides, and by the time it ended, I was 7 years old, and I had already learned to recognize the sound of incoming artillery." He began to pace slowly, his limp more pronounced now as if the old wound was reminding him of its presence. "At 18, I was conscripted into the Northern Alliance forces during the Second Cold War, and I spent 3 years fighting in frozen mountains against an enemy who looked exactly like me, who spoke a language similar to mine, who wanted nothing more than to go home to their families, just like I did." His voice grew quieter, but somehow more intense as he continued. "I killed my first enemy soldier when I was 19 years old. And he was younger than me, maybe 17. And he had a photograph of his mother in his pocket that was stained with his blood when I searched his body for intelligence." The Valkyrie warriors shifted uncomfortably because this was not the boasting they expected from a conquered species trying to impress them. This was something raw and painful that they did not understand. "I fought in 3 more conflicts after that," Cole continued, "and each one took something from me that I will never get back. And each one left scars on my body and my mind that will never fully heal." He stopped pacing and turned to face Thaxfer directly with those pale eyes that held depths of experience the commander could not begin to fathom. "I am not here to threaten you," the old general said. "I am here because I know what war costs, and I have paid that price in blood and pain and memories that wake me up screaming in the middle of the night." He gestured at the ribbons on his chest, each one representing a battle or a campaign, or an act of courage that he would rather forget. "Humanity does not send its young and eager warriors to meetings like this. And we do not send our strongest or our fiercest or our most bloodthirsty." His voice dropped to barely above a whisper, but every being in the chamber heard him clearly. "We send soldiers like me, old men who have buried their friends, old men who know exactly what happens if these talks fail, old men who desperately want to save your people from the same fate that haunts our dreams." Thaxfer felt that doubt creeping back into his mind, but he pushed it away with a snarl of irritation. "You speak as if we should fear you," he said dismissively. "But I see nothing to fear in an old soldier with shaking hands and tired eyes." General Cole smiled again, and this time the smile held no warmth at all. "You are right that you should not fear me," he said quietly. "I am old and tired, and I want nothing more than to sit in my garden and watch my grandchildren play. He leaned forward slightly, and his voice dropped even lower. "But you should fear the ones who will come after me if these talks fail. The young ones, the angry ones, the ones who have not yet learned the cost of war and who are eager to teach it to someone else." He straightened and clasped his hands behind his back once more. "I am here to give you a chance to walk away, Commander, and I am here to prove to my own people that we tried to find peace before we found war." The old general's eyes met Thaxfer's burning gaze without flinching. "Please, for both our peoples, do not waste this chance." But as he looked at the pride and contempt in the Valkyrie commander's face, Marcus Cole knew in his heart that his words had fallen on deaf ears, and he felt the familiar weight of sorrow settling into his bones as he prepared for what he knew was coming. She sat alone in her personal quarters, surrounded by holographic displays that cast harsh blue light across her pale scales, and her amber eyes had grown bloodshot from staring at the endless stream of data that poured from the human archive. At first, she had approached the task with professional detachment, expecting to find nothing more than the primitive military, records of a backward species that posed no real threat to the Dominion. She had been so terribly wrong. The data chip that the old human general had given them contained everything. And Kethrol meant everything, because the humans had hidden nothing and had not tried to make themselves look better than they were. She had started with their ancient history, watching recordings of primitive humans fighting with sharpened sticks and rocks, killing each other over territory and resources and ideological differences that seemed meaningless to her alien mind. But even then, something was different about them. Other species that the Valkyrie had studied showed similar patterns of early violence, but they had grown out of it as their civilizations matured, putting aside their savage instincts in favor of logic and cooperation. The humans never stopped. Their weapons evolved from sticks to swords to guns to bombs, but their willingness to use them against each other never diminished, and if anything, it only grew stronger as they developed more efficient ways to kill. Kethrol watched footage from something the humans called World War I, and she felt her stomach turn as she saw millions of young males charging into walls of projectiles, dying in such numbers that the ground itself became soaked with blood. They dug trenches in the mud and lived in them like animals, surrounded by the corpses of their friends, while poison gas melted their lungs and artillery shells tore their bodies apart. And still they kept fighting for 4 long years, until both sides had nearly destroyed themselves. She thought nothing could be worse than that. Then she watched World War II. The images of burning cities and mass graves played across her screens as she learned about something called the Holocaust, where the humans had systematically murdered 12 million of their own kind, simply because they were different. She saw the aftermath of weapons called atomic bombs, devices that could erase entire cities in a single flash of light. And she learned that the humans had not only invented these weapons, but had actually used them against populated areas. Kethrol had to pause the recording and sit in darkness for several hours after that, trying to process what she had witnessed. When she resumed, she learned about the Cold War, a decades-long standoff where 2 human factions had aimed thousands of nuclear weapons at each other, each side ready to destroy their entire planet rather than surrender to the other. They had named this strategy mutually assured destruction, and they had meant it. She watched footage of guerrilla wars where human fighters with nothing but simple weapons had held off massive military forces for years and even decades, hiding in jungles and mountains and cities, refusing to surrender even when hope seemed impossible. She learned about something called the Tet Offensive, where fighters who should have been defeated by every logical calculation had launched a massive surprise attack that shocked the world. She watched recordings from a conflict in the frozen mountains that the old general had mentioned, and she saw human soldiers fighting in conditions that should have killed them. Temperatures so cold that metal became brittle and exposed skin. Frozen minutes. They kept fighting anyway. Catherall began to notice patterns that disturbed her more than any single event. When humans were pushed into a corner, they did not surrender, and when they faced certain defeat, they did not negotiate, and when their situation became hopeless, they seemed to fight harder than ever before. She found records of human soldiers throwing themselves onto explosive devices to save their companions. Humans crashing their aircraft into enemy vessels rather than retreat. Humans fighting to the last breath, even when there was nothing left to fight for. She learned about something called kamikaze, a word that meant divine wind, and she watched young human males pilot explosive-filled aircraft directly into enemy ships. Dying with smiles on their faces, she learned about a place called Thermopylae, where 300 human warriors had stood against an army of hundreds of thousands, choosing certain death over retreat. She learned about a siege called Stalingrad, where humans had fought building by building, room by room, for months in the freezing cold, losing over 1 million lives but refusing to give up their city. And she learned about the human capacity for revenge after something called Pearl Harbor. The humans had spent 4 years crossing an ocean to destroy the nation that had attacked them, culminating in those terrible atomic weapons that had erased 2 cities in heartbeats. They did not forgive, and they did not forget, and they did not stop until their enemies were utterly defeated. Catherall pulled up the casualty statistics for just the past 3 centuries of human history, and the numbers made her scales turn pale. Over 500 million humans had died in organized warfare during that time, killed by their own species, and yet their population had continued to grow, and their technology had continued to advance, and their willingness to fight had never diminished. She cross-referenced this data with records from the species the Valkyrie had conquered, and the comparison made her blood run cold. Every other species had a breaking point, a threshold of casualties and destruction, beyond which they would choose survival over continued resistance. A logical calculation that life under submission was better than no life at all. The humans showed no such threshold. They had lost 20% of their population in single conflicts and kept fighting. And they had watched their cities burn and their children die, and still refused to surrender. Catherall saved the data and rose from her station on unsteady legs, knowing that she had to bring this information to Commander Thaxfer immediately. She found him in the command center, still confident, still proud, still planning the conquest of Earth, as if it were just another subjugation in a long line of victories. "Commander," she said, and her voice trembled in ways she could not control, "I have completed my analysis of the human military archives." Thaxfer turned to face her with mild interest in his burning eyes. "And what did you learn about our new subjects?" Catherall swallowed hard and tried to find the right words to explain what she had seen. "Commander, they are not like the others," she whispered. "The species we conquered. They fought until hope was lost, and then they submitted because they understood that resistance was futile." She pulled up a holographic display showing the human casualty statistics. The endless wars, the cycles of violence that stretched back to the beginning of their recorded history. Humans do not seem to understand when hope is lost. She continued. They fight harder when they are cornered, and they invent new weapons in the middle of wars. And they teach their children songs about glorious last stands. Thaxfer frowned at the data, not quite comprehending what his science officer was trying to tell him. Catherall stepped closer and lowered her voice even further. "The old soldier who came to meet us. He's not a threat, Commander." She paused and looked into his eyes with something very close to fear. "He is a mercy, and he's what they send when they still want peace." Commander Thaxfer listened to his science officer's report with growing impatience, and when she finished speaking, he dismissed her concerns with a wave of his clawed hand. "You have spent too long staring at old recordings," he said coldly. "These humans may have a violent history, But they are still flesh and blood, still mortal, still bound by the same laws of physics as every other species we have broken. Catherall tried to protest, but Thaxfer silenced her with a glare. The Valkyrie Dominion has conquered over 200 species, he continued, his voice hardening with each word. Some of them were violent. Some of them were technologically advanced, and some of them believed they could resist us. He turned to face the main view screen, where a small blue planet hung in the darkness of space. They all fell. And the humans will fall too. The negotiations had ended 3 days ago, with humanity refusing to accept the Dominion's terms of unconditional surrender. And General Cole had been escorted back to his shuttle with that same sad smile on his weathered face. Thaxfor had expected the humans to reconsider once they had time to contemplate the alternative. Instead, they had sent a message stating that any attack on human territory would be considered an act of war and would be met with the full force of their military response. The commander had laughed when he received this message, and he was still laughing now. We will show them what happens to species that defy the Dominion, he announced to his officers. Select a small human colony for demonstration purposes. Somewhere isolated enough that the lesson will be clear, but not so large that it wastes our resources. His tactical officer highlighted a target on the star map, a mining outpost called New Haven that housed approximately 50,000 human colonists on the edge of their territory. Perfect, Thaxfer smiled. Destroy it completely and ensure there are survivors to spread word of what happened. Catherall felt sick as she watched the Valkyrie warship change course toward the human colony, and she wished desperately that there was something she could do to stop what was about to happen. The attack on New Haven took less than 6 hours. The colony's defenses were primitive compared to Valkyrie weaponry, and their small security force fought bravely but hopelessly against the overwhelming firepower that rained down from Thaxfer watched the destruction with satisfaction, noting how the human defenders kept fighting even as their positions were overwhelmed, how they refused to retreat even when retreat might have saved their lives. He attributed this to stupidity rather than courage when it was over. 43,000 humans were dead, and the remaining 7,000 survivors were left to pick through the rubble of their homes. Just as Thaxfer had planned, he sent a message to the human government, offering them one final chance to surrender before he destroyed another colony. Confident that they would now understand the futility of resistance, the response came 6 days later. But it did not come in words. Catherall was the first to see the sensor readings, and her scales turned white as she stared at the display in disbelief. "Commander," she called out, a voice barely above a whisper. "You need to see this." Thaxfer strode over to her station with irritation in his burning eyes, expecting some minor technical glitch that his incompetent science officer could not handle. What he saw made him freeze. In place, ships were appearing at the edge of Valkyrie space. More ships than the Dominion's intelligence had suggested humanity possessed. Ships that seemed to materialize from nowhere as if they had been hiding and waiting. They were not the primitive vessels that the Valkyrie had observed during their initial surveys, and they were not the outdated civilian transports that had been spotted near human colonies. These ships were built for war. They were sleek and angular and bristling with weapons, systems that the Valkyrie could not immediately identify, and they moved in perfect formation with a precision that spoke of extensive training and preparation. "How many?" Thaxfer demanded, his voice suddenly hoarse. "Still counting," Catherall replied, "but based on current readings, at least 300 capital ships and over 1,000 support vessels." She looked up at her commander with fear in her amber eyes. "Sir, our intelligence suggested the humans had perhaps 50 operational warships at most. Where did all of these come from?" Thaxfer did not answer because he did not have an answer. A communication request flashed on the main screen, and when he accepted it, the face of General Marcus Cole appeared before him. No longer sad and no longer tired, the old soldier sat in what appeared to be a military command center, surrounded by younger officers in dark uniforms who moved with purpose and barely contained fury behind him. "Commander Thaxvar," Cole said, and his voice was flat and hard like stone. "I told you I was the warning, and I see that you chose not to listen. You dare threaten the Valkyrie Dominion," Thaxvar snarled, trying to recover his composure. "We will destroy your entire species for this insolence." Cole did not react to the threat, and his pale blue eyes held no emotion as he continued speaking. "I want you to understand something, Commander. I want you to understand it clearly, because there will be no more chances after this." He leaned forward slightly, and the image on the screen seemed to grow colder. "I did not fail in my mission, and I succeeded in exactly what I was sent to do, which was to give you an opportunity and to prove to my own people that we tried everything possible to avoid what is about to happen." Behind him, one of the younger officers smiled, and it was not a pleasant smile. "What mission?" Thaxvar demanded. "You spoke of warnings and peace and gave U.S. meaningless data about your primitive wars. I gave you our history so that you would understand what we are," Cole replied. "I gave you every chance to walk away because I did not want this. Because I've seen enough war to last 1,000 lifetimes. Because I knew exactly what would happen if you pushed us." His voice dropped to barely above a whisper, but it carried clearly through the communication link. "My granddaughter was on New Haven, Commander. She was 12 years old, and she loved to paint pictures of flowers. And she died when your weapons hit the residential sector where her school was located." Thaxvar felt something cold settle in his stomach as the old general continued. "I will not be commanding the fleet that is coming for you, because I am too old for active combat duty. But I want you to know that I tried to stop this." He shook his head slowly, and for just a moment, the sadness returned to his eyes. "The soldiers who are coming for you now are not old men like me, and they are not warnings. They are young, and they are angry, and they have been waiting for this moment since they were children, listening to stories about what we would do if anyone ever threatened our homes again." General Cole straightened in his chair and clasped his hands before him. "I could not stop them even if I wanted to, Commander, and after what you did to New Haven, I am not certain I would want to." The younger officer behind him stepped forward, and Thaxvar could see the rank insignia of a fleet admiral on her collar. "Commander Thaxvar," she said, and her voice was ice. "This is Admiral Sarah Chun of the United Earth Defense Fleet. You have committed an act of war against humanity, and we will respond accordingly." She smiled, and there was nothing pleasant in it. "You laughed when you saw our warning, and now you will learn why we sent one." The communication link terminated, leaving Thaxvar staring at a blank screen as the human fleet continued to pour into. Valkyrie Space Thrill watched her commander's face and saw something she had never seen before in 2 centuries of serving. Under him, she saw the beginning of fear. In the beginning, Commander Thaxvar and the other leaders of the Valkyrie Dominion believed that their superior numbers and experience would eventually overcome the human fleet, that these soft creatures would calculate their losses and negotiate for surrender as every other species had done before them. They were wrong. The humans did not fight like any enemy that Valkyrie had ever faced, and they did not seem to understand the concept of acceptable losses or strategic withdrawal, or any of the logical principles that governed warfare between civilized species. When human ships were damaged beyond repair, their crews would aim them at Valkyrie vessels and accelerate to maximum speed, dying in fire and glory rather than surrendering or retreating when human ground forces were surrounded and outnumbered. They would dig in and fight to the last soldier, making the Valkyrie pay in blood for every building and every street and every inch of ground. When human colonies were threatened, their defenders would strap explosives to their own bodies and walk into Valkyrie command posts with smiles on their faces. By the third month, Valkyrie commanders had begun to refuse assignments that involved fighting humans directly. And by the fifth month, some of them had started to desert. Kethrel kept detailed records throughout the conflict, documenting everything she witnessed because she believed that someday, somehow, this information might help prevent such a war from ever happening again. She watched as human tactics evolved at a speed that the Valkyrie could not match, their strategies changing and adapting in response to every Dominion action, as if they had been preparing for this conflict their entire lives, and perhaps they had. She learned that the ships which had appeared at the edge of Valkyrie space were not new construction but rather hidden reserves, vessels that humanity had secretly built and concealed throughout their territory in case they ever needed them. The humans called this the just-in-case fleet, and they had been building it for over 100 years, planning for the day when someone would try to conquer them. Kethrel thought about General Cole and his sad smile, and she understood now what he had been trying to tell them. Humanity did not want war, but they had never forgotten how to wage it, and they had never stopped preparing for the possibility that peace would fail. By the 8th month, the tide had turned completely. The Valkyrie Dominion, which had conquered over 200 species across 1,000 star systems, found itself losing territory for the first time in its history. Subject species that had been crushed beneath Valkyrie rule for generations began to rise up, inspired by the example of these strange pink creatures who refused to surrender regardless of the odds against them. Thaxfer received reports of rebellions spreading across the Dominion like wildfire. Former slaves who had accepted their fate for centuries suddenly finding the courage to fight back against their masters. He ordered his officers to request peace negotiations, swallowing his pride for the first time in his long life. But the humans' response was simple and terrifying. We do not negotiate with those who target civilian populations, Admiral Chun stated in her reply. You had your chance for peace, and you chose to murder our children. The war continued in the 10th month. Human forces reached the outer defenses of the Valkyrie homeworld, and Thaxfer finally understood the depths of his miscalculation. He had thought the humans would fight until they suffered enough losses to make them reconsider. But they had not reconsidered, and the losses seemed to make them angrier rather than more cautious. He had thought superior technology in greater numbers would eventually overwhelm human resistance. But the humans had adapted and invented and overcome every advantage the Dominion possessed. He had thought that humans were just another soft species to be conquered and added to the Dominion's collection of subjects. And he had been catastrophically wrong in the 11th month. Human ground forces landed on the Valkyrie homeworld. Kethrel watched from a hidden location as the invaders methodically dismantled the empire that had ruled this region of space for millennia. And she was surprised by what she saw. The humans did not burn the cities or slaughter the civilians or take revenge for the colonies that had been destroyed during the war. They came as conquerors. Yes, but they also came as something else. Something that Kethrel struggled to understand. They came as liberators. The subject species that the Valkyrie had enslaved were freed, one by one, and given the choice to return to their homeworlds or to build new lives in human-controlled space. The war criminals who had ordered attacks on civilian populations were identified and arrested, to be tried for their crimes under laws that the humans seemed to invent as they went. Commander Thaxfer was among those arrested, and Kethrel heard that he had died in custody before his trial could begin. Though whether by his own hand or another's, she never learned. A new Valkyrie government was assembled from the survivors, from those who had opposed the war or who had tried to minimize civilian casualties or who had simply been too low in the hierarchy to make important decisions. Admiral Chen met with this new government on the same station where General Cole had once stood before Thaxver. And she delivered humanity's terms. "Remember us," she said, her voice hard but not cruel. "Tell every species you ever conquered what happens when you ignore the warning. Tell them about the old soldier who came in peace and was laughed at. And tell them about what followed when you chose to attack us." She paused and looked around the chamber at the Valkyrie officials who sat in terrified silence. "We do not want to do this again," she continued. "We have seen enough war to last us forever, and we have buried enough friends and children and loved ones." Her eyes grew cold. "But we will do it again if we must. And you will tell the galaxy that this is true." The Valkyrie agreed to every term because they had no choice. And the war ended not with celebration, but with exhaustion and grief on both sides. Kethril dedicated the rest of her life to studying humanity, trying to understand these strange creatures who could be so violent and so compassionate, so terrifying and so generous, so willing to destroy and so eager to rebuild. She compiled her research into a document that became required reading in military academies across the galaxy. A warning to future generations about the species called humans, and at the beginning of this document, she placed a quote that she had found in the human archives. Words that had been spoken centuries ago by a human leader whose name had been lost to history. "We do not seek war, but we do not flee from it either. And those who mistake our desire for peace as weakness will learn that we remember how to fight." Centuries later, the story of General Marcus Cole became legend across the galaxy, passed from species to species as a warning and a lesson. Other civilizations learned to read the signs, to understand what it meant when humanity sent their tired and wounded veterans to first contact meetings instead of their young and eager warriors. If the humans send an old soldier who walks with a limp and smiles with sadness, there is still hope for peace. If they send their young ones with fire in their eyes, it is already too late. And in quiet moments, when beings from 1,000 different species look up at the stars and wonder about the universe they live in, they sometimes think about that old human saying that has been translated into every known language: "We do not want war, but we have never forgotten how to wage it." And they remember the old soldier who tried to warn an empire, and the price that empire paid for ignoring him.